Thanks, Jane, and good morning to everybody that's watching this morning. I'm going to talk through the background really and sort of basics for spring bean production. I'll also give you a little bit of information about potential markets, and we'll go through as much as we can really in the next 40 minutes, as there's quite a lot of information obviously available and to get through this morning. So when we look at area and production for spring beans, well, field beans in general actually, so these figures that you can see here are area in 1,000 hectares, volume of harvested production and yield. Up to 2019, the figures are from DEFRA statistics, and the 2020 data are from provisional statistics from Eurostat. So we can see that area fluctuates on a roughly sort of 7 to 8 year cycle. And in the last 4 or 5 years, you can see from the red line at the top, which is yield, that yield has been quite variable as well. And we'll talk about some of the issues around yield variability as we go through this presentation. So at the moment, we're in a sort of roughly between 500 and 600,000 tonnes of beans produced per annum. When we look at end uses, the majority of our beans, certainly in 2020, went into the animal feed market. So that's a good market. Most beans are not grown on contract, apart from seed, of course. We had a smaller quantity of beans that went into the human consumption market, which is traditionally one of our sort of key target markets for field beans. But we need really good quality beans, good colour, light colour, and also low bruchid damage. And that is one of the subjects I'll talk about a little bit later. The bruchid damage is perhaps one of the things that prevents field beans going into the human consumption market. There's also a growing market for salmon feed in Scotland and Norway. And we have a few novel uses as well, or developments for bean fractions, which include beer and also bread as well, some baked products. Our exported field beans of good quality go into Egypt and the Middle East, into fulmadam, which is almost like a baked bean stew, and falafel. One thing I do like to do really, I suppose, when talking about beans in general, is to talk through the benefits and the rotation. I think it's really important, and certainly from our point of view at PGRO, we would always say consider it as a rotational crop and not always just as an individual crop. They can give good returns anyway, but they have huge benefits in the rotation that should also be considered. Beans are a source of homegrown protein. Bean protein content and grain content can be 26 to 30% protein. They're a nitrogen fixing crop. They don't require mineral nitrogen fertilizer at all. And in fact, using N on bean crops can prevent nodulation. So the other benefit, of course, is that they give a benefit to the following crop, and that can be anywhere between 0.6 and 0.9 tonnes per hectare. So keep that in mind. It reduces inputs. They can reduce energy use and CO2 emissions in a rotation, and they do improve soil structure and microbial populations. There are other non-N pre-crop benefits from such as P&K. And as I said, the gross margins of legume rotations can exceed non-legume rotations, and this is really down to the lower inputs and the positive pre-crop effects. Of course, one of the key benefits is this break that we get in disease infection in cereals and oilseed rape. And it spreads the workload, so drilling dates and harvest dates can be slightly different, which might help in terms of operations on farm. So many growers are growing beans for use in animal feed on farm, either as a silage product or as crimp grain. And often the benefits there are greater because we've got the return of nutrients in the manure onto farms. So, and of course, they do provide great benefits for pollinating and other beneficial insects, particularly bees. So a quick review of the 2020 season. I mean, going back to that graph showing the yield fluctuations that we've seen, particularly in 2020 and 2018. I mean, A lot of that's down to the weather, of course, and that's something we can't really do anything about, but we can help put beans in a position where they can tolerate difficult weather conditions better. What happened in 2020 was we had this very wet autumn in 2019 going into the winter, and then it dried up very rapidly in March and April. So winter beans weren't drilled, spring beans were drilled, perhaps slightly later in some cases, and some winter beans were drilled in the spring as well. And the issue then was that conditions became very dry. So you can see from the picture at the bottom right-hand side there, establishment was quite patchy in some cases, not all, but in some, and actually quite uneven. So we did tend to get a second wave of establishment when we got a bit of moisture. So that caused us a few issues. It's possible that this wet autumn and winter again in 2020 to 21 might lead to a greater area of spring beans in 2021, although some winter beans have been drilled at this point. So just to consider some of the factors really that then will help us to sort of overcome some of these issues really, and some of these stresses in beans, they are a moisture loving crop. So but there are other factors to consider as well. So rotationally, you should not be growing any legume more than 1 in 5 years. And that's largely for disease management. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about foot rot management in particular. Although they don't necessarily require a fine seed bed to get good herbicide efficacy, of course, the level seed bed is required. For drilling depth, optimum depth of drilling is about 10 to 12.5 centimetres, so approximately 3 inches. And that is really to get them deep enough so that the herbicide damage doesn't occur, for instance, also so that you haven't got your crows and rooks pulling them out, but not so deep that establishment is slowed down. So I think you want to be making sure that they're going into good conditions. Some people are using min-till and direct drilling, but you do need to make sure the seeds are well covered and that there's good seed to soil contact, and that you're not leaving open slots. We do emphasise this last point on this particular slide is wait for the right conditions. Don't force spring beans into difficult conditions. It just isn't worth it. The impact of that can be very great on establishment and yield. So if it's cold and wet, wait for as long as you can till the right conditions occur. One of the factors that really impacts on how field beans perform is compaction and soil structure. And I'll talk a little bit more as well about some of the results that we've seen from the Yield Enhancement Network and from a project that we've been running for a couple of years, a bit later on in the presentation. But compaction reduces root development and penetration and can have significant effects on yield. You can see from the picture at the top right there what happens, of course, and this isn't just beans that do this, of course, it's any crop really. If you've got significant compaction, the roots go sideways, and of course that means that when we do have years like 2018 and 2020 where moisture deficit is quite high, they're not able to get access to the moisture. It does also lead to waterlogging, of course, when rainfall is high, as the water is not able to percolate through the soil. So although beans can tolerate wet conditions, they don't like to be waterlogged for long, and it will cause long-term damage to the root system and yield impact. So it's really important to get soil structure right when you start, and it does have quite a significant impact on soil-borne pathogens, particularly the foot rot pathogens in beans as well. So any poor soil structure can lead to greater pressure on the plants really, and greater disease infection. So really important to have a good soil structure. For specifically really when we look at the foot rot infection, we're talking mainly about Fusarium here, and you can see the impact it can have at the base of the root there in those pictures, and plants fail often and will wilt. We've talked about soil structure and rotation, so just to emphasise soil structure needs to be good, rotation is 1 in 5, and conditions at establishment need to be good. There's a few other factors that you might consider. Cropping history, so if you have a long history of bean production or legume production, then you are likely to have a higher pathogen burden in the soil. And so you may want to think about extending rotations if that's the case, and particularly if you're seeing foot rot infection in beans regularly. Conditions during the season are difficult to mitigate, really, because we have had some really hot spring and early summers. And when the plants are under high stress conditions, we do see greater disease pressure from the foot rot diseases, as well as other diseases. So I think just going back really to getting them into the right conditions to try and help reduce pressure before we even get started. So prevention is important because there's no chemical control for foot rot diseases in beans or peas. When we look at establishment a bit more, sowing and seed rate, optimal sowing time is really, I suppose, up to the end of March. For some people, it could be later if they have good soil moisture retention and perhaps if they're using direct drilling, for instance. But we would probably say late March. Once we start to get into April, we do often see yield declining when we're planting in April. Seed rate generally is 50 to 55. You should be targeting 50 to 55 plants per metre square. And if you're on very fertile soil types, then 40 plants, drop it back to 40 plants per metre square. And this gives us we know from previous work that these give us the optimum economic yield for beans. And we have a good tool that can help calculate that, which is the OptiBean tool, which is available on our website. Generally allow about 5% field loss when calculating your seed rate for spring beans, although sometimes we don't see any field losses. And you can use the PGRO app actually for more information on agronomy in general, but also there's a seed rate calculator on the app. If you don't have the app, although I would strongly advise you do have it, this is the calculation that you can use to work out seed rates in kilograms per hectare. Quick update on the PGRO, what's now the Pulse Descriptive List. Many of you will know, I think there's been quite a lot of publicity around the change from the recommended list to the descriptive list in 2021. Just to say really, firstly, that the number of trials that we're doing has not changed, and the amount of data that we're generating to go into providing the descriptive list is exactly the same, if not slightly better, I'd say, actually. The reason that we've changed to a descriptive list is to give a bit more flexibility about what characters we can include, how we can keep some varieties on the list, you know, and use other characters to keep them on the list. And so I think this is a positive move actually for PGRO and for growers. And you can see there's a good list of spring beans in 2021. So everything is carrying on the same in terms of trials work. We've added a few characters, and particularly you will see there in the middle of that table roughly, we've got a column for rust tolerance. So that's been the first time that's gone onto the spring bean list, and that's useful actually in terms of determining which varieties have got rust, a bit more tolerance to rust. All of the information from the descriptive list, so it's on a downloadable spreadsheet from the website, but also this information is available on the PGRO app. Again, a good reason to have the app. For seed quality, this is really important, and we've seen some decline in seed quality over the last 2 or 3 years, partly due to conditions at harvest, so very dry, hot conditions at harvest that might have led to some physical damage to seed, but also, of course, bruchid damage, and at very high levels. And so we're not talking, 10% bruchid, we're talking at sort of 40% plus bruchid damage. Then it can start to have an impact on germination capacity. So important to get seed tested for germination, particularly if you're farm saving. Bought-in seed will be tested, and you're looking at 80% or more really in terms of germination capacity. Test for stem nematode. Stem nematode is a seed and soil-borne pest. It's what you can see in the bottom left there, actually, is they're microscopic nematodes, free-living, and in the seed they are desiccated in a desiccated form that survives for quite a long period. Once they're in the soil, they can survive for up to 10 years. There are 2 species. Dictylenchus gigas is the one that mainly affects beans and does cause the most damage to bean yields and also to quality of the seed. Dictylenchus dipsaki has a wider host range than Gigas, but doesn't really affect beans in quite the same way that Gigas does. But it's something that needs to be sort of borne in mind really across the rotation. There isn't any treatment for this pest, although we are doing some work with a student at Harper Adams to look at the use of cover crops or biofumigant cover crops to help reduce levels in soils, which is looking quite positive. So it really is a case that it needs to be screened out at the seed stage. You shouldn't be planting seed that has any nematodes in it. Another disease actually which doesn't quite affect spring beans as much as it does winter beans is Ascochyta fabi, but we don't have any seed treatments to control this. So it's important that we test for it and that we don't use seed that has more than 1% Ascochyta. We talked a bit about physical damage and moisture content and the impact that that can have on germination. So important to keep that in mind as well. The important thing about moisture content and physical damage as well is that when you move, every time you move seed, you can lose germination capacity. So every time you move it, if it's very dry or damaged, 5% germination can drop off. So important to keep that in mind. Weed control, you can see we've got a good number of pre-emergence products in spring beans. Nirvana's a good broad spectrum product, and then some of the others give additional control of certain weeds. Bazagran, which is Bentazone, is our only post-em product, so it's important to make good use of pre-em products and use Bazagran when necessary. I've included the next slide really to just give you an idea of the spectrum of weeds that each of those products controls. We have an excellent weed expert at PGRO, and that's my colleague Jim Scrimshaw, who can give you any information you want about rates and specific weed control for these products that we've got. And one thing I did want to talk about, which is the Bentazone stewardship guidance that we have at the moment. Bentazone is an active substance that's found widely in surface water and is the active substance most detected in groundwater. Now, we use the stewardship guidance because if we do not reduce levels in groundwater and surface water, it's very likely that we'll lose Bentazone as a product. And as our only post-emergence product, it's really a valuable tool for us for legumes. So the rules are really look for groundwater in high-risk zones. You've got drinking water, groundwater safeguard zones, or groundwater source protection zones 1 and 2. So establish if you're in one of those zones. Maximum dose is 1,000 grams of active substance per hectare and really only used from April in the spring and early summer. If you're in those high-risk areas on the shallow sort of light soil types, then you shouldn't be using it at all. And in all other areas, try and avoid use on those shallow soil types. For surface water, really, I think the guidance is looking at heavy rainfall. If that's likely in the next 48 hours, then avoid use. Of course, avoid use when drains are flowing, and do use buffer zones to help prevent runoff or spray drift into water courses. It's really important that we follow these guidelines because I think we could lose the product if we don't. It isn't an option to increase water treatment capacity. So I think just important to keep this in mind when using Bazagran. For blackgrass control with a spring crop, of course, we've got the opportunity to follow stale seed beds and to control weeds before we drill. Later drilling can help in the spring with blackgrass, and there are a few products that may have some low levels of activity, but we don't, of course, have the products that we have in winter beans to control blackgrass. So it does need some careful management. So I'm going to move on to diseases now. We have a few key diseases. There are more diseases, but these are probably the ones that are going to affect you the most, apart from foot rot, which we've already discussed this morning. Chocolate spot is probably the one you're most familiar with. Rust we saw last year, and downy mildew is one that spring beans are affected by. And as you can see from this slide, the yield impact from those diseases can be quite significant if it's not controlled. So I'll talk through each one individually and just give you a bit of guidance about how we can manage these better. Chocolate spot is a cool wet weather disease in the main. It starts with small chocolate coloured spots on the leaves, and then gradually, as the disease progresses, it becomes much more aggressive and can cover the whole leaf area and defoliate the plant. So if you get early infections with this disease, then it can cause some significant yield impact. But in spring beans, we usually don't see quite as much impact from the disease as we do in winter beans, although in high disease pressure, it can cause problems. And we have had a couple of years where we've had wet conditions in June, and that's led to some quite high disease pressure. And of course, it can also affect the flowers, and hence it can affect pod set. So that's really how it's affecting yield. So preventative sprays are important when you know that you've got conditions that are going to be suitable for chocolate spot development. So it's the wet weather. And also, if you start to see the small spots, then you really need to take action quite quickly. Spray, the critical timing, and this is the one not to miss really, is the first pod timing. So that's the roughly mid-flower timing. And then a second spray 3 to 4 weeks later, which you could combine with your rust control. And we'll talk a little bit more about rust in a minute. So we've got good active substances available for chocolate spot management. We've got azoxystrobin, boscalid and pyroclostrobin, which is Signum, cyprodinil and fludeoxonil, which is Switch, and then some more generic products like metconazole and tebuconazole, which will control chocolate spot. And I'll show you a little bit of data in a minute about how these compare perhaps to what we've had in the past, which is chlorothalonil and ciproconazole, which is the ultra elite type products. So for azoxystrobin, there are some clear disease responses to dose rate for chocolate spot. So the lower the dose, the less disease control we see. Signum gives very good control of chocolate spot at 0.7 kilos per hectare. And it's a product that we would strongly recommend when you're under high disease pressure. It's a really very good chocolate spot control product. And as you can see, although these data are from winter beans, it gives a really good yield response and good chocolate spot management. So a good product. Azoxystrobin plus tebuconazole gives good control of a disease and a good yield improvement as well versus untreated plots in these trials. And then we looked at ultra elite within this trial as well, all these trials, and saw that although it gives a sort of good, a lowish level of chocolate spot control and a lowish level of yield, it can give some effect. But actually, when we look back at the data, we can see that Signum and the other products that we've got give actually much better control and better yield. You can only use tebuconazole once in a program, and I'll talk more about the program after we've talked about rust and downy mildew. And just check harvest intervals, of course. Don't get caught out by those in these hot, dry summers. Bean rust is a warm weather disease. It develops rapidly later on in the season when we have hot days and cool, humid nights. And we've seen last year certainly quite high levels of rust in beans. And as I said, you would include a product for rust control in the second application that you're putting onto spring beans. So again, there's a good choice of products. Tebuconazole is very good. So it might be that you would leave your tebuconazole application to the second spray in this case, but azoxystrobin is also very good. Signum can be good. I think it wasn't ever sort of sold really as a rust product, but it can give good control. But you may want to select tebuconazole or azoxystrobin for rust. And you can see here that there are some varieties that have slightly better tolerance to rust. These are only 1 year's data though, so just be a little bit careful. We will continue to evaluate rust where we can, where we have good disease levels in the trials, and update the list, of course, each year. For downy mildew is a cool, humid weather disease. So we tend to see it sort of earlier, around that sort of early flowering timing, I suppose, in spring bean crops. It mainly affects spring beans, not really winter beans, although we do see it a bit in winter beans. It's not a major issue, really. And there is a tool called Crop Monitor, which is available through this link, which shows risk through the season from approximately the beginning of April throughout the season. So that might be a useful tool. We do have a product which is a metalaxyl M straight foliar product called SL567A, which gives a really good control of downy mildew, and it is the only one that gives control of downy mildew. So you might include that in a program where you have downy mildew as a problem. But what we do have for downy mildew is some long-term data about resistance to the disease, and we can see there we've got 2. So the higher the rating, the better the disease resistance. So on the list for 2021, we've got Lynx and Yukon that's showing really good tolerance to downy mildew. Mara Speed has been on the list for donkey's years, still showing good tolerance to downy mildew. And then anything 5 and above really is not too bad. So do have a look at the descriptive list for information about tolerant varieties. So when we look at our fungicide program overall, it's likely that you're more likely to be using a 2 spray program for spring beans, possibly only 1 if the conditions are good and don't favour disease development. But 2 spray program would include chocolate spot as your key target at that first pod stage, so Signum, or you could use azoxystrobin plus tebuconazole or metconazole or switch, and include SL567A if downy mildew is present on 25% of the plants. T2, rust is probably your key target with chocolate spot, so again, you might choose to leave the tebuconazole to that second application to control rust. When we come on to insect pest management, we have a few key pests again, and I'll just talk about a few of them really. Pea and bean weevil is the earliest one that you'll see. It overwinters around the field margins of your previous year's crops, moves into crops when temperatures reach approximately 10 to 12 degrees, and it's walking into the crop from the field margins. So you'll see the effect on the field margins on the edges of the crop first, as the weevil notching around the edges of the leaves. But that's not really causing the main damage. The damage is caused by the larvae feeding on the root nodules. So the weevils lay their eggs and the larvae get washed into the soil and feed on root nodules as they start to form. There's a really good trap system available for pea and bean weevil monitoring, available from Coppet UK. They should be going out really in February as temperatures start to warm up in this early spring stage. There's 5 traps per system. They should go onto the field margins of the previous year's crops. If you don't have a previous year's crop, then obviously put them on the margins of your current crop, or where you're planning to put your spring beans. And they need to be checked 3 times a week. It's a pheromone trap, so it's attracting the weevils into the trap. The threshold is quite high actually, so it's 30 weevils average across the 5 traps. And then once you've reached a threshold, you should spray when you've first seen signs of weevil notching in the crop, and particularly if the crop has emerged in the last 10 days or is likely to emerge in the next 10 days. Those are the crops that are most at risk. The reason that we're saying monitor more carefully now and use this trap system is because we know that there's reasonably widespread resistance for weevils to pyrethroids, or at least partial resistance on farms. And therefore avoiding use of those products, as we don't have anything else, is really key. So use the trap systems to help you make these decisions. Aphids, there are 2 really that affect beans. Pea aphid is likely to be the one that is transmitting viruses into the crop earlier on in the season. Black bean aphid forms large colonies later in the season. It can transmit a few viruses, but tends not to be its main sort of damage form, if you like. It causes damage by direct feeding, and also the honeydew that's left after feeding by either aphid leads to increased levels of chocolate spot in the crop. So pea aphid likely to be transmitting viruses into the crop. And there are a number of bean viruses, all look quite similar, but can do quite a lot of damage to yield. I'll talk about insecticides after I've sort of talked through the key pests really, because we can have a look at a program of insecticide use. Aphid management is difficult, but there are some biological control agents that are available. So you can buy ladybirds and predatory wasps, and there are some organic surfactants and plant extracts that are available for aphid management in beans. But really we should be starting to look at the use of non-crop areas and field margins to encourage our natural enemies, And we have seen years where we've seen really large numbers of ladybirds, particularly, and hoverflies in crops. And it's really very important that we encourage these to help reduce aphid issues. There's some research in Europe that indicates that intercropping might be helpful to provide barriers or dilution, and also to cause changes to the crop microclimate. So that might help with aphid infestations as well. For bruchid beetle, you all know, I suppose, what the damage is from this pest, and it causes this damage to the seed that you can see here in the slide as the adult emerges at harvest time, at dry harvest. They're overwintering around the margins of your previous year's crops, particularly, I suppose, in the larger trees under the tree bark. And they are a later flying pest, so they will be moving into crops from April onwards, and particularly into flowering crops where the females need to feed in order to become reproductive. They can survive on other plant hosts, on plant pollen, but they don't really become reproductive on other pollen. So, and once they're in the crop, they start to lay eggs as soon as the pods form on the bottom of the plant. And that, after that point, it's not possible to control because there's no really systemic products that control the larvae. So it's important to manage this pest as an adult. So our current recommendation is to spray when the maximum daily temperature has reached at least 20 degrees C for 2 consecutive days, and when the crop is at the first pod stage, and then apply a second spray 7 days later. Some of you may know that the Syngenta PGRO bruchicast system has been taken down now. Really, from discussions about that tool, we decided really that it was not quite as useful as it could be. It was giving predictions to spray every day effectively during the period of risk, which is May and June, which isn't really the message that we want to give growers. So you currently only have pyrethroid products available to manage this pest. You need to space them out at 7 days and check labels for flowering restrictions, because some of the pyrethroids are restricted during flowering. Work that's been done in the past shows that not only angled nozzles give good penetration into the crop, and it's important that you do this, but Lecler ID3 gave the best penetration to bottom leaves. Water volume, stick to as close to 200 litres as you possibly can. There's no benefit to going higher than that, but really dropping water volumes is not a good thing to do. It doesn't give you good coverage of the crop, and it will reduce efficacy of the products that you do have, which are, again, quite limited at the moment. So when we look at insecticides, you can see that we've got really just pyrethroids and pyrimicarb. For pyrethroids, if you are using them to manage bruchid, then you should not be using them during the daytime. You should aim to use them in the evening or very early morning, whilst bees are not foraging. And there are a few that you can use during flowering. Do check harvest intervals and the number of applications that you've permitted, and maximum dose rates, of course. For aphids, the key aphicide that we have, of course, is pyrimicarb, and we can only use it once. So if viruses are your key issue, it's possible that you may decide you need to use this earlier. However, if that's not the case, then you would preferably save this for your large colonies that are causing feeding damage. Pyrethroids at best give partial control of aphids. We hope to have new products into the crops, of course, but at the moment that's not looking immediate, certainly. For harvest aids, at the moment for beans we only have glyphosate. It's not a desiccant, it is a weed control product. So, and in most cases, if you've got weed-free crops, you shouldn't really need to desiccate, as the leaves will fall during ripening. So, and glyphosate doesn't have much effect on the stems anyway. We had last year Spotlight Plus on an emergency off-label approval. We don't quite know yet whether we'll have it again for this year, because you can't use glyphosate on seed crops, of course. So you do need another product in seed crops. For harvesting, fit to combine at 18% moisture content, but wait until only a few stems are green. If you're long-term storage, then you're looking at moisture content of 14%. Quick word about the Yield Enhancement Network. We're encouraging people to join the Yield Enhancement field bean yen and also combining pea yen. So anybody that's growing combining peas as well, please do join the Yens. They're not competitions in our case, so the Pulse Yens are not competitive. What they are is a benchmarking facility for growers, really. We've had 39 field bean entries in 2020, 32 returned yields, and you can see on the map there the sort of approximate location of those. So we've got a reasonably good distribution. We could do with a few sort of a bit further north as well, of course. And so we've got a total of 52 over the 2 years, mostly, well, more spring beans than winter beans at this stage. So please do enter Yen. I'll just give you a bit of an update on some of the results that we've got from Yen as well. So for spring beans, potential 2020 grain yields were generally in excess of 11 tonnes per hectare. Some of you I know probably won't be getting too close to that, but some people are, 7 or 8 tonnes per hectare, so they're not too far off that. We have sort of preliminary associations with some of the things that we've measured, and particularly the soil and foliar nutrition sort of aspects. So, but also the physiological ones. So the length of the growing season is important. The longer the growing season, the higher the yield. And then obviously, of course, some of the other factors like shoots, pods and seeds per shoot, and 1,000 seed weight and harvest interval are associated with higher yields. So similar in some ways to the cereal results. And you can see the map here on the right hand side showing potential yields across the UK. PGRO, we did also a bit of more detailed work on 14 of the sites across 2 years, where we were working with Hummingbird Technologies, who use drone flights and satellite data to monitor NDVI, which is a measure of canopy health and cover, and co-funded by Innovate UK. And these formed the basis of the Yen in the first year. And we've collected a lot of data actually from these trials. So some of the general comments I'd say at this stage are, for soils, yield was positively associated with high pH, increased soil organic matter content, and improved soil structure. So it's really backing up what we know, but also giving us some good data to show that these factors are really important, both for spring beans and winter beans. There are other significant associations between soil nutrition that was measured and yields. Some are quite weak, and we need to look more closely at those and probably to look at them in more detailed trials. For foliar nutrients that were measured, there was a really positive association with increased potassium levels. And one comment I'd make about that, I suppose, is that it is something that we see coming through our lab, through our plant clinic more frequently, is potassium deficiency. So we saw stronger responses in 2020 than 29 to our measured nutrition levels, and I think that's because there was a much greater stress on plants in 2020. We did some preliminary work to look at earthworm numbers, and we found a strong association where we had high levels of earthworms, yield was higher. And in fact, the site with the highest earthworm count was in the top 25% of the Yen crops. I'm nearly done, coming to the end. So just to say thank you very much, everybody, for turning up this morning and for listening to me. It seems like a quick whiz through everything about spring beans. For further information, you can talk to any of us at PGRO. There's myself, I can talk to you about pests and diseases. My colleague Leah is our pathologist, and my colleague Jim Scrimshaw is our herbicide and weed control expert, and Steve Belcher will give you advice on varieties and more general agronomy. These are my direct contact details, the PGRO phone number there. We do run an advisory service all year, so you can talk to us at any point in the year, email us at any point, and we have a plant clinic that runs the whole year round. So please do send your poorly plants to us. That is free at the point of contact, so we can give you a diagnosis. If we have to send it to another lab for virus diagnosis, for instance, or nutrition, then we'll make a charge for that. But for most things, we can give you a result, and we can do that for free. The seed testing laboratory is not free, but obviously we strongly encourage people to have seed tested if they're farm saving. Everything else you can find on the website or talk to us directly. And that's me finished. So I think I'm going to hand back to Jane and the guys at the technical end and take questions.
Thank you very much, Becky. That was a fantastic whistle-stop tour of how to grow spring beans. I know there was an awful lot to cover there, so thank you, and thank you everyone for your attention. We've had some great questions through on the chat, which I'll get to in a minute. If you've got any questions that you'd like to add to that, again, please either use the chat function if you're logged in, or use Slido. Just type that into your phone or an alternative window with the code BEANS21. So Becky, a couple of these questions came sort of before you got to that topic, but I'm still going to ask you them anyway, and then you can just do a recap and elaborate a little bit more. So first of all, this was a pre-submitted question that we had via the registration form. What is the single biggest thing growers do wrong when establishing a spring bean crop? Poor nutrition, drilling dates, seed rate, or something else?
I think there's probably a couple of things, I suppose. I talked a bit earlier about not pushing them into difficult conditions. I think it's tempting sometimes to try and get them in to make sure that you're not hitting that dry period that we generally see in April and May. It's really important not to push them in too early into cold, wet conditions. But of course you can go early if the conditions are right. So it's not, we don't have a calendar date really. We don't say stick to a calendar date. Nutrition, no, I'd say that's probably not the key problem. Not always anyway. Soil structure, really important. And I've emphasised that quite a few times through the talk, really. That is probably the key factor that needs to be got right in order to have a successful crop. And that applies to all crops, of course.
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. Just linked to that, so you talked about the effects of compaction on beans, but what about the benefits of beans on soil structure? Are there any?
Yes, there are. I mean, the beans obviously can be quite deep-rooting crops. They send their roots down to, roughly a metre, I'd say, and sometimes more. And they're quite strong-rooted, when they're healthy crop anyway, certainly. So I think there's that benefit to soil structure of having a deep-rooted crop. And obviously they can improve microbial populations just because of their sort of nature of the crop itself being a nitrogen fixing crop. So,
right, thank you. So a nutrition related question now, just thinking back to the first one. Do you have any trial work on sulfur? And is it worth adding to the seed bed? This person has a bit of polysulfate spare, and they were thinking of doing a split field trial with 0, 100 and 200 kilograms per hectare of it.
Yeah, we have looked at sulfur. Yeah, definitely. We don't find very good responses to sulfur, I suppose. We did look at polysulfate as well. I think the reason for that is that we're not seeing at this stage much in the way of sulfur deficiency in the crop. And it's certainly not something that's come through our plant clinic. As I said, the trials that we didn't show any responses. I mean, I think it's definitely worth a try if you think that you are suffering from sulfur deficiency, then yes, of course, do try it. The other thing that I looked at, actually, I guess it was a question that was sent through beforehand, was the yen data and also the hummingbird data that I was just talking about. I had a quick look through that. So even in sort of reasonably lowish soil sulfur areas, there don't seem to be any deficiencies in the plants from any of those trials over 2 years. So we're not seeing sulfur deficiency. I think we need to be somewhat careful because the guidelines for nutrition levels in foliar samples particularly are not necessarily set for peas and beans. They're set for other crops. So, but at this stage, I would say we're not really seeing sulfur coming up as an issue. We're seeing potassium coming through, definitely, but not sulfur.
Okay, so potassium, the one to watch.
Yeah.
A bit more than sulfur. Okay. So just going through here. So this was another pre-submitted question that we had via the registration form. What do you consider the best herbicide program on heavy soil where the key weed burden is blackgrass, charlock, hedge mustard and groundsel?
Yeah, so I had a good chat with my colleague Jim at PGRO about this as well. So he's given me a bit of advice about this too. Defy will give you control of charlock, prosulfocarb of charlock and groundsel at 4 litres per hectare, and then the Centium at about 0.25 litres per hectare will help with the hedge mustard particularly, and possibly a bit with the groundsel. Nirvana's a good broad spectrum product, of course, which includes charlock and groundsel, but you'd need to add clomazone again for hedge mustard. And then, if necessary, bentazone as a follow-up, really. The issue with blackgrass is we don't really have any products for blackgrass control. So again, you're going back to sort of using stale seed beds and spraying off before drilling for blackgrass management, to be honest. So.
Okay, thank you. So this came in before you got to this point, so if you can just recap on it and then add to it. So do you have any work on row spacing and seed rates?
Yes, we do actually. We've done a lot on seed rates in spring beans, and hence why we've got the recommendation for target plant population for 50 to 55 plants per square metre. I have to check actually the row spacing stuff. Steve's done the work, definitely. And it's possible that I think he'll have written that up and put it into one of our magazines. So if we can take some details, I can send you the references to the work that Steve's done in terms of row width and plant spacing. And some of that work was also done in Optibean as well, of course, a few years ago, which led to the change in the plant density recommendation.
I do actually have a name for that question. So.
Oh, good. Okay, we'll follow that up then. Brilliant.
Okay, another one. What is the optimum planting depth?
So talked about this a bit. I would say approximately 3 inches, 12 centimetres, 12 to 13 centimetres. And the reasons are, I suppose, are around the sort of not causing any damage from herbicides. Pendimethalin is one that can lead, particularly in wet conditions, that can lead to a bit of crop damage. It's usually not permanent, but it looks difficult to start with. Obviously, crows, rooks, pigeons will pull out seed that is too shallow. But on the other side of the argument, of course, is that if you plant them too deep, you plant them so deep that they're too cold and wet that they can't establish very quickly and you can't germinate. There's a possibility that some might rot. So we'd say about 3 to 4 inches.
We had a follow-up question on that actually, saying sort of which is it, 3 or 4, because I think 10 to 12 centimetres sort of equates a bit closer to 4.
It does.
Yeah. 3 to 4 inches.
Yeah. So it's 4. I suppose it is actually, isn't it? 4 inches. I don't work in inches actually.
We should work in centimetres. Yeah. So 10 to 12 centimetres.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And then a couple more questions on here. So if you do have any more, please do feel free to add them, because we're getting towards the end of the questions now. So are you still doing trials on starter fertilisers, and have you found any benefits?
We are looking at starter fertilisers. It's difficult actually to find very good impacts of these sort of nutrient products, but we continue to look at them. There was a lot of work done in peas in particular actually on phosphate a few years ago, which was done sort of directly pre-drilling, which showed really good influence on growth. But we just keep trying really. I think we'll report any significant findings when we get them, and continue to do it, and look at any new products that are coming along as well. I think there are a couple of new ones that we'll be looking at this year, so we'll report on findings as we get them. I think that there's a bit of variability about excuse me, and how effective they are, and on the conditions, of course, that lead to them being more effective. So I think that's just need for further work really on that point.
Okay. And a pea and bean weevil question now, which I think you partly covered earlier, but if you could just recap and then expand. So what is the best spray for pea and bean weevil, and the timing?
So yeah, pea and bean weevil, we only have pyrethroids. We know now that there's at least partial resistance on many farms across the UK. So you really should only be using products when you absolutely need to, and hence the use of the threshold system and the trapping system. Traps need to go out now, really, in preparation for weather warming up, hopefully next week, and start to monitor for movement of pea and bean weevil. The crops that, as I said, have emerged in the last 10 days. So there's probably not many spring beans in the ground yet, I would think, because it's been too wet, or crops that are likely to be emerging in the next 10 days after you've reached that threshold of 30, an average of 30 across the 5 traps. Those are the ones that are going to be at most risk in terms of larval damage to root systems. You probably, I would say, if you apply a spray when you see first notching, when you've reached a threshold, what I would say is if it doesn't work and you're not seeing any control, don't do it again. It's not worth it. You've obviously got resistance on the farm and it just simply isn't worth it. The other thing I would say about weevil management is that if the damage often, we don't always see many yield responses. I suppose that's what I'm saying, to insecticides for weevil. The only time really that we see any yield responses is when we have very high other pressures on the plants. So if we're running into very dry and hot conditions, the combination of those conditions with weevil damage onto the root nodules can then lead to greater yield impact. So it's sometimes, I think, if you're not getting good control with pyrethroids, just stop doing it.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had a new question come in here. What soil temperature would you suggest waiting for at the 3 to 4 inch drilling depth before drilling?
Yeah, I did have a chat with my colleague about this the other day. There isn't really, we don't have a sort of recommended soil temperature for beans. They're not likely to grow very much below about 4.4 degrees C.
Okay.
But there's a very small amount of growth below that. But we don't really give a recommended. Obviously, the warmer the soils are in the spring, the more quickly they're going to germinate and establish, assuming that you've got a good moisture availability. So we don't give a specific temperature, but just be aware that below about 4.4 degrees, they're not going to grow very much.
Okay. So mindful of that, and of course the moisture.
Yes, definitely. I don't think that's going to be a problem just yet. But
yeah, great. Our final question now, and this was one of the pre-submitted ones. So if you've got any last-minute questions, anyone, this is your chance to get them in. If not, this is the last one. So I struggle with header losses when combining. Is there any evidence of a pod stick type product helping to reduce this?
A little bit. I mean, bean pods are quite tough pods, aren't they? And if they do spring open, then of course that is it does cause a few losses. But we have looked at pod stick type products, and generally I'd say the results are a bit variable. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. So I think there's not really any clear data about how well they work in beans. I mean, header losses, I think part of the issue perhaps is the increasing size of combines now. So large headers with not much flexibility on uneven ground. So we did have some data from peas, of course, that shows that if you're harvesting into the sort of direction of lean of the crop, then you tend to get slightly fewer header losses. Now that might also apply to beans, although if they're not lodging at all and if they're standing straight, then less likely to be the case. Peas tend to lodge more than beans, perhaps.
And that was a brilliant segue there, Becky, because speaking of peas, we have a Combining Peas webinar coming up 2 weeks today on the 18th of February, same time, 8 till 9. So we'd love to have you back for that, and there'll be details coming out on how to register, but it's the same platform to view that. And that will be joined by Dr. Leah Harold from PGRO. So I think that is about it from us. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to Becky for joining us today, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Hope you found that useful. And if you do have any further questions, be sure to get in touch with either ourselves or PGRO. Those details provided earlier, and PGRO and us will be happy to help. So I think that's it, and we hope to see some of you at the Combining Pea webinar in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.